Live NFL trivia every Wednesday night on Twitch at 9 p.m. Eastern. Come show off your football knowledge for a chance to win cash prizes. Check the link in the description to find out more. And now, on with our feature presentation. Cutting a player is never easy, especially if it's an undrafted free agent who's looking for his chance to make it in the league. When you have to cut a player, particularly an undrafted free agent, and let them go, you never know what's going to happen next. For some, they're able to find another landing spot and carve out a surprisingly successful career. For others, that was the last chance they're ever going to get to play football. Years of their life trying to make it to the next level, and just like that, it's gone. And they're never getting another opportunity to make it, as they'll have to start a brand new chapter, and perhaps one they didn't think was ever going to come in their life. It's always an extremely tough and delicate situation to cut a player like this. It's one that gets deliberated on by the coaches and the general manager and other front office personnel. Some of these roster cuts result in heated debates and are highly emotional, so they should always be handled with care. Anytime you're dealing with someone's employment, you should give it the respect it deserves. In other words, don't cut a player by accident. You would think an NFL team wouldn't accidentally cut a player and put someone on waivers that they never intended to, and then ask the league for a do-over. Yet in 1988, that's exactly what happened with the Phoenix Cardinals. And this is the story behind the strangest roster cut in Cardinals history. Before I talk about the actual decision to cut the player by complete accident, we need some context to understand just who the player is, and why the Cardinals signed him and brought him on in the first place. The main character in our story is a man by the name of John Talley. In 1984, when Talley first came to West Virginia, he was a quarterback. While he didn't play a whole lot as a freshman, he got some playing time under center in 1985. With his 6'5" frame, he seemed like he had the perfect mold to play the position. However, he struggled quite a bit, and finished that season completing less than 49% of his passes with 4 touchdowns, 7 interceptions, and a mere 4.7 yards per pass attempt. In the NFL, this would have come out to a passer rating of 47.5, which is obviously not ideal. Talley would later admit that he still missed the quarterback position, but that he was willing to do anything he could to help the team win, and that meant switching to wide receiver. While Talley was by no means a great wide receiver, and while he was incredibly raw at the position, having played quarterback up until then, he did produce a bit. In 1986, he had 27 receptions for 353 yards and 2 touchdowns, finishing second on the team in yards, receptions, and receiving touchdowns. West Virginia was not very good in 1986, going 4-7 and finishing with their worst record since 1978. But Talley being able to be somewhat productive in his first year at a new position had to be somewhat encouraging. And in 1987, Talley did more of the same. His stat line was virtually identical, as this time he had 25 receptions for 307 yards and 2 touchdowns. However, the numbers were more impressive when you consider the fact that West Virginia was much more of a run-oriented team that year, thanks to the electrifying play of dual-threat Major Harris and the hard running of Anthony Brown. Because of this, those 25 receptions ranked first on the team, doubling what second place had, and his 307 yards also ranked first on the team. And he was also a pretty solid kick returner, averaging 23.2 yards per return, which ranked 7th amongst all independents, and this was back when there were 24 independents, so that was pretty good. Talley was a fairly solid receiver for the Mountaineers over those final 2 seasons, and was hoping to hear his name get called at the NFL Draft. That did not happen. At the 1988 NFL Draft, there were 333 players who heard their names get called. Of those 333 players, 40 of them, or roughly 1/8, were wide receivers. They ranged from the first guy off the board in Notre Dame wide receiver and eventual Hall of Famer Tim Brown, who went to the Los Angeles Raiders, to the last guy off the board in Southern Oregon wide receiver and Mr. Irrelevant Jeff Beathard, who went to the Los Angeles Rams and never played a snap in the NFL. However, of those 40 guys, Talley was not one of them. Only one player from West Virginia was even drafted that season, with that being defensive end David Grant, who went to the Cincinnati Bengals in the 4th round. By the time the draft ended, Talley did not have a team, and did not have a job. He was going to have to try his luck as an undrafted free agent if anyone wanted him. On one hand, it's not surprising that no one drafted Talley. It did not come as a surprise to most people when Talley went undrafted. The man had only played wide receiver for 2 years. He struggled creating separation at times and making tough catches. If any ball was thrown lower than the chest, Talley was not going to make the adjustment to catch it, as even the slightest bit of an underthrow would have resulted in an incompletion. Obviously, stats are not everything in college. We see plenty of guys who put up great numbers who don't get drafted, and whose skills are unlikely to translate to the next level. But it's hard to get too excited over Talley's numbers. He had 52 receptions for 660 yards and 4 touchdowns in his entire career. Very few players are ever going to get drafted with that kind of career stat line, especially if said player finished 37th just across the independents in receiving yards in his final season. On the other hand, Talley seemed like the perfect guy to take a chance on as an undrafted free agent. The man was 6'5" tall, and he can't teach height. You get a receiver who can use his height to his advantage and possibly win jump balls and bail his quarterback out, and you take that opportunity, especially if it's cheap. Plus, even though the stats weren't great, he was still incredibly raw, having only played wide receiver for 2 years since he was a quarterback before that. With a little bit of proper coaching and development, you never know. Plenty of former quarterbacks have made the switch to wide receiver before, and plenty have done it since. With all that in mind, when the draft ended, the Phoenix Cardinals brought him onto the roster. Talley was going to have his chance at making it into the NFL and extending his football career past college. Unfortunately for him, it was an uphill battle from the start. With very few exceptions, mainly La'el Collins, anytime you're an undrafted free agent, you're already coming into camp behind the 8 ball. You have to really impress to make it onto the team, because the general manager in question has no real ties to you compared to the veterans and the rookies. And for the Cardinals, who were playing their first season in Phoenix, even though it was technically Tempe after spending 28 seasons in St. Louis, it was not going to be easy for Talley to make the team because of how deep they were at the wide receiver position. For one, the Cards spent 2 of their draft picks on receivers, taking Indiana wideout Ernie Jones in the 7th round and Miami, Ohio wideout Andy Schillinger in the 10th round. Jones in particular would go on to have a pretty solid career, especially for a 7th round pick, and would come awfully close to hitting 1,000 yards with the Cardinals in 1991 a few years down the road. They also had Roy Green, arguably the greatest receiver in franchise history at the time, and a man who had just under 6,000 yards and 48 touchdowns in his time with the Cardinals beforehand. They also had a few other depth guys, including Don Holmes, who had been with the team for a few years now and would eventually make it onto the team again in 1988. And they had J.T. Smith, the man who led the NFL in 1987 with 91 receptions and 1,117 yards. Inexplicably, he did not make the Pro Bowl, and I can't quite figure that out, because with the obvious exception of Jerry Rice, he was probably the best receiver in football during that strike-shortened season. Some teams on paper are easier to make the roster on than others. And the Cardinals were a tough team, considering the depth that they had, the quality of the players that they had, and the draft capital spent on other receivers. And this was especially true for a player who only started playing wide receiver 2 years ago and didn't have the greatest production in college. He was still a major work in progress. He was unimpressive in camp, and was unable to creep his way up the depth chart or impress Gene Stallings and the rest of the coaching staff. During the first cuts that the Cards made at the end of July, the team cut 10 players at a variety of positions. One of those 10 cuts happened to be John Talley. And in a normal world, that's the end of our story. In fact, it's a complete non-story. But this is not a normal world, because as it turns out, the Cards cut him by complete accident. That's right, the Cardinals never meant to cut Talley, and one day after putting him on waivers, Pro Personnel Director Larry Wilson removed him from waivers, essentially saying, "Yeah, we did not mean to do that. Our bad." Obviously, this raises the question. How the heck does an NFL team, considering all the thought and deliberation that goes into cutting a player and making a roster move like this, accidentally cut someone? And before I answer that question, I have to point out that the very same day, the team's public relations director, Bob Rose, resigned. The odds that he resigned because of this incident are slim and probably minimal at best. It's probably just a giant coincidence. But I like to imagine that he saw how dysfunctional the Cardinals were, and this was the last straw, because he didn't want to have to deal with the potential PR nightmare of accidentally cutting a player. Having said that, NFL rules at the time stated that a team could not waive an injured player. In other words, if you were injured, you could not be released from the team in this manner. Talley had an injury that he was dealing with, as he had a fractured thumb. The team obviously knew about this, but decided to waive him anyways, completely forgetting the rules. Amazingly enough, no one spotted this. There was not one person in the organization who knew the rulebook, saw what was happening, and stepped in to prevent Larry Wilson from doing this. How that slipped through the chain of command, I have no clue. But regardless, one day later, the NFL stepped in and said, "Yeah, our rules prevent you from doing this, so even though you want to cut him, you can't." And with that, Talley was removed from waivers. Somehow, this whole thing blew over. The Cards were not punished by the NFL for violating the league's rules, no team tried to claim Talley and make the entire situation even more awkward than it already was, and nothing more happened. This whole incident is just a footnote in the bizarre first season that the Cardinals played in Phoenix, and neither Talley, nor Wilson, or any other front office member addressed the press about the whole fiasco, which is odd, because you would think someone would have asked how a team could be that incompetent to accidentally cut a player. However, this whole mess would be a pretty good indication of how Talley's career went, because he struggled to make it at the next level. Talley was cut a few weeks later by the Cardinals, ending an incredibly bizarre run for a random undrafted free agent. Fortunately for him, the Cardinals were not the last team that he played with, as he got some more opportunities to continue his pro football career. Nothing really materialized from those moves, however. He bounced around the rosters of the Miami Dolphins and the Philadelphia Eagles, but never made it onto either team's active roster. Finally, in 1990, he got his chance. when he made it onto the roster of the Cleveland Browns. For the first time in his career, he was actually playing in NFL regular season games. It was a bit later than he would have liked, but he finally got to accomplish his dream. Talley didn't do a whole lot with the Browns, and only finished his career with 3 receptions for 41 yards. He only played occasionally, and even played a bit of tight end during that 1991 season under some random head coach you've probably never heard of who goes by the name of Bill Belichick. However, after that 1991 season, which Talley primarily spent on the physically unable to perform list and on injured reserve, he never got another opportunity to play in the NFL again. Still, the fact that he underwent that position change, had to go through a lot, went undrafted, and had to grind and wait his turn just to make it to the next level should be admired. By all accounts, the odds were stacked against Talley. He didn't play wide receiver until his junior year, and was in an offense that did not throw the ball. When he got a chance to play in the NFL, he went to a team that was either so incompetent that they did not know the rules, or disliked Talley so much that they were willing to break the rules just so that he wasn't on the roster anymore. And then he was able to bounce back from that and make it onto an NFL roster, which, even if only for a brief period of time, is a heck of an accomplishment considering the hundreds of undrafted free agents that come out every year. As for any general managers watching this, a word to the wise. Know the rulebook, or if you don't know the rulebook, have someone close in your camp who does. Because if you don't, you might accidentally cut a player like the Cardinals did and look incredibly stupid and careless in the process. Get your official Jaguar Gator 9 merchandise by going to jg9shop.com, and be sure to like this video, ring the notification bell, subscribe down below if you haven't already, as it helps the channel out a lot, and be sure to check out Twitch every Wednesday night at 9 p.m. Eastern for your chance to play NFL Trivia and win cash prizes, link in the description below. If you want to see videos like this condensed down to 60 seconds, then follow me on TikTok at JaguarGator9, and subscribe to 60-second NFL History on YouTube. To see highlight videos of players throughout the history of the NFL, subscribe to JG9 Highlights. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. See how you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.